In the spring of 1890, the southern edge of Chicago was a wasteland. Jackson Park, a stretch of marsh and sand along Lake Michigan, held little more than stagnant water, scrub oak, and wind. Within 3 years, this swamp would become the most photographed place on Earth. It would carry a name that sounded like a fairy tale, the White City. The occasion was the World's Columbian Exposition, planned to mark 400 years since Christopher Columbus reached the Americas. Congress awarded the fair to Chicago in 1890, beating New York, St. Louis, and Washington. The city had barely recovered from the Great Fire of 1871, yet its leaders promised something staggering. They would raise a metropolis of palaces from the mud, and they would do it fast. The numbers were almost impossible. Nearly 700 acres would be drained, graded, and transformed. More than 200 buildings would rise, some larger than any structure yet built by human hands. The manufacturers and liberal arts building alone would cover 44 acres under a single roof, enclosing enough space to hold entire armies. Canals would be dug, lagoons shaped, a wooded island landscaped, and a grand basin lined with plaster gods and gilded statues. All of it aimed at a single opening date, May 1st, 1893. But here lay the paradox that defines this entire story. The city being built was never meant to survive. Its glittering white walls were not marble. Its towering domes were not stone. Nearly everything visitors would admire was temporary by design, engineered to dazzle for a single summer and then disappear. The men behind it knew this from the beginning. They were not constructing a permanent capital. They were staging the grandest illusion of the 19th century, a mirage of civilization conjured from lath, plaster, and paint. 27 million people would walk its avenues. They would believe, if only for an afternoon, that they had glimpsed the future of the human race. And within 18 months of its opening, almost none of it would still be standing. To understand how a city could be born to vanish, we must first meet the men who dreamed it into being. The task fell to a partnership of two men with opposite temperaments. Daniel Burnham, the chief of construction, was a driven Chicago architect who believed in scale and speed. Beside him worked Frederick Law Olmsted, the aging landscape genius behind New York's Central Park, who saw the fair not as buildings, but as scenery, water, and light. Burnham famously urged his colleagues to make no small plans. In 1890 and 1891, he summoned the finest architects in America to Chicago and asked them to design an entire city together. Richard Morris Hunt, Charles McKim, Louis Sullivan, and George Post answered the call. Around a single table they divided the fairgrounds, each taking a monumental building. They agreed on a shared vision drawn from ancient Rome and Renaissance Europe. Classical columns, domes, and a uniform cornice height of 60 feet along the central basin. The deadline crushed them. Ground was barely broken in 1891, leaving less than 2 years to conjure a metropolis. Olmsted battled the swampy soil, dredging lagoons and shaping the wooded island. Burnham drove crews through brutal Chicago winters, employing thousands of laborers who worked in freezing lake winds and choking dust. Delays, deaths, and budget crises haunted the site. John Root, Burnham's brilliant partner, died of pneumonia in January 1891, before the design was even finished. Then came the decision that would shape everything. There was no time to build in stone. Real masonry would take years and fortunes the fair did not have. So the architects chose a shortcut, a material that could be molded into columns and cornices within days, then painted to imitate marble. It would let them raise the illusion of eternal Rome in a matter of months. It was a gamble that traded permanence for spectacle. The buildings would look ancient and indestructible, yet they would be little more than shells. Burnham accepted the bargain knowingly. The White City was designed as a stage set on a colossal scale, meant to overwhelm the eye and then fade away. But what exactly was this miracle material that could turn a swamp into a marble empire almost overnight? The secret lay in a single substance: The secret was called staff. It was a cheap, malleable mixture of plaster of Paris, cement, and fibers such as jute or hemp, spread over wooden frameworks. Poured into molds, staff could reproduce columns, statues, garlands, and ornate cornices in enormous quantities and at astonishing speed. Workers cast it in shops, hauled the pieces to the buildings, and fastened them onto timber and iron skeletons. What looked like solid carved marble was often only an inch or two thick, hollow behind its elegant surface. The great palaces of the fair were, in truth, gigantic sheds dressed in costume. Behind the classical facades stood ordinary wood framing and steel trusses, the same construction used for warehouses. The magic lived entirely on the outside, in the staff, and in one final touch that gave the fair its legendary name. As the buildings neared completion, crews sprayed them with a coat of white paint. This was among the first large-scale uses of spray painting in construction, allowing workers to coat vast surfaces quickly. Under the sun, the uniform whiteness turned the fairgrounds into a blinding vision of purity and order. Visitors began calling it the White City, and the name stuck forever. Yet everyone involved understood the illusion. Staff was never meant to endure. It cracked in frost, softened in rain, and crumbled under weather. The buildings were rated to last only a year or two, long enough for a single fair season. Maintenance crews patched them constantly during the exposition, chasing cracks and stains as the plaster aged before the public's eyes. This was architecture as theater. The designers had built a stage set the size of a city, convincing enough to fool millions into believing they walked among permanent monuments of a new civilization. The whiteness suggested marble clarity and the triumph of order over the grime of industrial America. It was beautiful precisely because it was fragile, a dream pressed thin over wood. And nowhere was that dream more overwhelming than at the heart of the fair, where the greatest palaces gathered around a single shimmering pool of water. There stood the crowning spectacle, the Court of Honor. At the center of the White City lay the Court of Honor, a formal composition of water, stone-white walls, and sculpture, arranged with breathtaking symmetry. Its heart was the Grand Basin, a long, rectangular pool nearly 350 feet wide, reflecting the palaces that ringed it. Gondolas and electric launches glided across the water while crowds gathered along the balustrades. Rising at one end stood the Statue of the Republic, a colossal gilded figure by Daniel Chester French. She towered 65 feet tall, holding a globe and an eagle, her surface covered in gold leaf that flared under the sun. At the opposite end, the Columbian Fountain by Frederick McManus erupted with allegorical figures, a barge of the ship of state pulled through cascading water. Around the basin stood the greatest buildings of the fair. The Administration Building, designed by Richard Morris Hunt, crowned the western end with a soaring gilded dome. To the north spread the Manufactures and Liberal Arts Building, its 44 acres making it the largest roof structure in the world, big enough to have swallowed several city blocks. The Agriculture Building by McKim, Mead, and White, the Machinery Hall, and the Electricity Building completed the ring, their matching cornices holding to Burnham's disciplined 60-foot line. For visitors arriving by train or steamer, the effect was overwhelming. They stepped from the smoke and noise of Gilded Age America into a hushed, white theater of columns, arches, and glittering water. Many wept. Some fainted. Writers compared it to a vision of heaven or a dream of ancient empire made real. In an era of coal soot, cramped tenements, and muddy streets, the clean geometry of the Court of Honor felt like a prophecy of what cities might one day become. Yet the effect was carefully engineered. The white surfaces, the mirrored water, and the monumental scale worked together to erase all sense of the ordinary. This was beauty as persuasion, an argument in plaster that order and grandeur were within America's reach. But the fair had one more revelation in store, a spectacle that arrived only after the sun went down and transformed the White City into something no one had ever seen. When darkness fell over Jackson Park, the White City became something the world had never witnessed. Thousands of incandescent bulbs outlined the buildings, traced the cornices, and studded the domes. Searchlights swept the sky. Fountains were lit from below, turning columns of water into shifting sheets of color. Visitors who had marveled at the daytime marble now stood stunned before a city made of light. This was the frontier of a new electrical age, and the fair was its greatest showcase. The contract to illuminate the grounds became a battlefield in the war between two systems of electricity. Thomas Edison's General Electric championed direct current. George Westinghouse, working with the ideas of Nikola Tesla, backed alternating current, which could be transmitted efficiently over distance. Westinghouse won the bid, undercutting his rival and staking the fair's success on his technology. The result was a triumph for alternating current. The exposition drew power from a massive generating plant inside Machinery Hall, its engines and dynamos humming to feed roughly 100,000 incandescent lamps across the grounds. It was one of the largest electrical installations ever attempted, consuming more electricity than many entire cities of the day. For most Americans in 1893, electric light was still a rumor. Homes burned gas and kerosene. Here, suddenly, an entire metropolis blazed at the touch of a switch, steady and clean, without flame or smoke. The Electricity Building displayed the coming revolution directly, showcasing motors, telegraphs, and Edison's Tower of Light, a glittering column encrusted with thousands of bulbs. Crowds pressed inside to see machines that promised to reshape daily life. What they were witnessing was the birth of the modern world rehearsed in miniature, a preview of the electrified century ahead. The nighttime White City sold a vision of progress more powerful than any speech, proof that human ingenuity could banish darkness itself. And yet, like everything else at the fair, the glow was temporary. The bulbs would burn for a single season before the power went silent. For 6 brilliant months, the world would pour through the gates to see this impossible city, by day and by night, 27 million people converging on a dream that was already counting down to its end. On May 1, 1893, President Grover Cleveland pressed a golden telegraph key, and the machinery of the White City roared to life. Fountains erupted. Flags snapped in the wind off Lake Michigan. Over the next 6 months, more than 27 million people passed through the gates of Jackson Park, at a time when the entire United States held only about 63 million citizens. It was as if 1 in every 3 Americans had come to walk these gleaming avenues. They arrived by train, by steamer, by streetcar, paying 50 cents each to enter another world. Beyond the solemn court of honor lay the Midway Plaisance, a mile-long strip of spectacle and noise. Here, order dissolved into carnival. Visitors rode camels, watched belly dancers, sampled foods they could not name, and stared at recreated villages from Cairo to Java. And above it all turned the fair's great mechanical marvel, George Ferris's wheel, 264 feet tall, carrying 2 160 passengers at once in 36 glass cabins the size of streetcars. It was America's answer to the Eiffel Tower, and it lifted riders high enough to see the whole shimmering city spread beneath them like a vision. Down in the crowds, ordinary lives unfolded. Children lost their parents. Vendors sold Cracker Jack and Juicy Fruit gum, both introduced here. Somewhere in the throng, a young man named H. Holmes worked his own darker trade nearby. For a single summer, the White City felt permanent, inevitable, a glimpse of the century to come. But it had always been a countdown. The buildings were plaster and fiber, designed to last months, not years. The financing was temporary. The nation itself was faltering. 1893 had brought a brutal financial panic, banks collapsing, factories closing, unemployment climbing. On October 30th, 1893, the fair closed its gates. The lights dimmed. The 27 million departed, leaving behind an empty city of white palaces, standing silent in the autumn cold. No one had decided what to do with them. And into that abandoned dream, in the winter and spring that followed, would come the fire. The closing ceremony, planned for October 30th, 1893, was meant to be triumphant. Instead, it became a funeral. 2 days earlier, Chicago's popular mayor, Carter Harrison Sr., had been shot dead in his own home by a disappointed office seeker. The city plunged into mourning. The grand finale was canceled, replaced by a somber memorial. The White City went dark on a note of grief. Then came the reckoning. The financial panic of 1893 had already hardened into a full depression. Banks failed by the hundreds. Millions lost their jobs. In the fairgrounds, the plaster palaces stood empty and unguarded, their staff surfaces cracking in the winter freeze. They were never built to survive. On January 8, 1894, fire broke out in several structures, including the casino and the peristyle along the lakefront. The temporary materials, jute fiber, plaster, wood framing, burned like kindling. Firefighters could do little. That summer brought worse. The Pullman strike erupted in the spring of 1894 as railroad workers protested wage cuts in the Depression economy. The conflict spread across the nation, and Chicago became its epicenter. On July 5, 1894, amid the unrest, fire swept through the heart of the fairgrounds. The great buildings of the Court of Honor, the Administration Building, the Manufactures and Liberal Arts Building, the Agricultural Building, went up in a single spectacular blaze. Crowds gathered to watch the White City die. Flames climbed the domes and columns that millions had marveled at. The Statue of the Republic glowed orange in the firelight before the structures around her collapsed. By nightfall, the dazzling metropolis was a field of smoldering rubble and twisted iron. What the fire spared, demolition and scavengers finished. Salvage crews carted away metal and timber. The canals filled with debris. Within a few years, the ground where 27 million had walked returned to open parkland, as if the city had been a dream that Chicago woke from. Almost nothing remained standing. Almost. For amid the ashes, a handful of structures had been built differently, and one of them still stands today. Not everything in the White City had been an illusion. A few builders, thinking beyond a single summer, had used real materials, and those choices decided what would outlive the flames. The greatest survivor is the Palace of Fine Arts. Because it was designed to house priceless paintings and sculptures loaned by nations around the world, insurers and organizers demanded genuine fire protection. Its exterior was still coated in staff, but beneath that white skin stood a substantial brick structure, far more solid than the plaster shells around it. When the fires of 1894 consumed the Court of Honor, the Palace of Fine Arts endured. For years afterward, it housed the Field Columbian Museum, until that collection moved to a new home in 1920. The building then fell into decay, its temporary outer surface crumbling. It might have been lost like the rest. But in the 1920s, Chicago decided to save it. Financed largely by retail magnate Julius Rosenwald, a massive restoration replaced the deteriorating staff facade with permanent limestone, faithfully reproducing the original design. In 1933, it reopened as the Museum of Science and Industry, a role it still fills today, welcoming millions on the very ground where the fair once stood. A few other traces persist. The Norway Building, a wooden stave church, was dismantled and relocated, surviving in Wisconsin. The World's Congress Auxiliary Building, constructed downtown as a permanent structure, became the Art Institute of Chicago, still standing on Michigan Avenue. The great gilded statue of the Republic that presided over the Court of Honor was destroyed, but in 1918, a smaller bronze replica was erected in Jackson Park, marking where the original once stood. And scattered across the world are fragments carried home as souvenirs, plaster shards, medals, photographs. These are the relics of a city that was never meant to last. Everything else, the canals, the domes, The endless white colonnades that stunned 27 million visitors dissolved back into the Chicago swampland from which it rose. Yet the White City refused to disappear entirely. Its true survival was not made of brick or limestone at all, but of ideas. The buildings burned, but the vision did not. The White City lived on in the minds of everyone who had walked its avenues, and in the ambitions of the men who built it. Daniel Burnham, the fair's director of works, carried its lessons forward into a movement that would reshape America. The unified, monumental, classical order of the Court of Honor became the blueprint for the City Beautiful movement, which swept through American urban planning at the turn of the century. Its influence is everywhere. The grand civic centers, the broad ceremonial malls, the white marble government buildings that define Washington, D.C., the 1902 Macmillan Plan that redesigned the National Mall drew directly on the fair's principles. Burnham himself went on to author sweeping plans for Cleveland, San Francisco, Manila, and, most famously, the 1909 Plan of Chicago, which imagined the lakefront parks and boulevards the city still enjoys today. The fair also lit the way into the electrical age. Westinghouse's alternating current, demonstrated across the illuminated grounds, won the argument over how the world would be powered. Within decades, entire cities glowed at night as the White City once had, and its wonders entered the imagination. The Ferris wheel became a fixture of fairs everywhere. L. Frank Baum, who visited the exposition, is said to have drawn on its shimmering white towers when he dreamed up the Emerald City of Oz. Photographs of the fair inspired generations of architects, dreamers, and planners who never saw it standing. That is the strange power of the White City. It existed for a single summer. It was plaster and paint, staff and lath, designed to crumble. Yet a temporary city has shaped permanent ones for over a century. Its ghost still walks in every grand civic plaza, every gleaming boulevard, every promise that a city can be beautiful. The palaces were always meant to fall. That was never a failure. It was the plan. The men who dreamed it understood a paradox at the heart of ambition. Some visions matter most precisely because they cannot last. They built a city to vanish.